Hello lovely people, this video is going to be the first one in the ultimate tweeter shootout, and today we're going to measure some tweeters in the actual car just to see what kind of response can we get. So the purpose of this test is not necessarily to make picture perfect measurements, but to compare all of these and all of those tweeters, how they would measure in a car. The huge disclaimer in this video is that every single car will have a slightly different response depending on the location and on the car. This is a Skoda Octavia 2014, and I'm putting the tweeter somewhere there in the kind of corner sill pillar where you would usually have your tweeter installed. So either you would have it somewhere like on the A pillar, maybe a little bit higher, or you're gonna have it in the sill, or maybe in the very corner over there. But this is gonna give us a general idea of the differences between these tweeters, because I can tell you straight away they do measure differently and they do sound differently. So for example, now I have which one is it? Dean Audio Deckers. So this one is just a second one, because this one is DOA, dead on arrival. This one doesn't work, so I grabbed the second from the pair, and it's just simply connected to my tweeter output. I'm just going to show you in the DSP we have EQ bypassed, and it is crossed at 2000 Hertz, Linkwitz Riley 24 dB, and I have the same crossover for all the tweeters just to make it, I don't want to say kind of fair, but kind of fair. And basically when we play pink noise, it plays pink noise, and we can measure. So I already measured them. I did the measurements yesterday at night because this is the next morning. I finished measuring just before midnight, and you can see that yes, there are differences between the tweeters. You can see some stands out there, some stand out there. So we will jump into this and I'm going to show you everything. But most of them, you can see the highest number of them are somewhere there in the middle. And for example, this one is measuring like this. So you can see that it's from about 3K all the way up to 18, 19. Is almost totally flat. So this is going to be a very good measurement. Now, I'll tell you straight away that I can tell how a tweeter measures and how it's going to sound just by the sound of the pink noise. So I am used to pink noise. I tuned quite a few vehicles that I know how a nice sounding tweeter should measure, and I can tell the difference only by listening to pink noise. I don't need to listen to music. When I hear the pink noise, I can tell you straight away if it's going to be harsh, if it's going to be very fatiguing, or if it's going to be very mellow. So this is going to be the correlation that a lot of people ask, what is the correlation between the measurements and how we hear? So we will go through everything. Now, this test, I'm having it as the first one because it's not as good as the one that we're going to do on the baffle, because you can see this, I'm just putting the tweeter there. Different tweeters will stick out a little bit more. Smaller ones are going to go deeper inside. So it's not as accurate and as precise, but I still think it's going to give us a very good comparison between different tweeters, because yes, different tweeters do measure differently and they will sound differently. So without any further ado, let's jump into the laptop and let me show you what I have. So before analyzing the actual data, I'm going to put another disclaimer. Basically, I'm going to repeat myself again that this test, these measurements, are not necessarily representative of how the actual tweeter measures, because it is in my car, in my install, in my specific location. And it doesn't mean that if you take, for example, I don't know, any kind of one driver, let's say this one, it doesn't mean that if you have the same driver in your car that it will measure exactly the same way, because every car is different. So this comparison between all of these drivers is going to be more from the perspective of how we hear the tweeters and why they sound different, because I already had questions under some of my videos and under some of my posts where people asked, how do measurements correlate with what we hear? So this is exactly what I'm going to try to show you. You see that all of these drivers are measuring very, very differently. Yes, some of them do measure very similar. However, this is not taking into account the crossover frequencies. All of these drivers are crossed at 2 kilohertz right there. And this is a picture that I found probably like 10 years ago, and this encapsulates perfectly why this test is not so objective and it's more going to be subjective. So this one says you have different animals, and it says for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And imagine fish will not climb that tree. Exactly the same like if you take a piezo driver, is not gonna play down to 2 kilohertz. If you're gonna take an AMT, which is supposed to be crossed at probably 8, 9, 10 kilohertz, and you cross it at 2 kilohertz, it's not fair. So this comparison again will be more from subjective side, and I will tell you why tweeters sound differently and what to look out for. So this test, if we're talking about relative differences between the drivers, is going to be very useful for people that might run a passive system and just want a specific sound signature. Because for example, if you take these two drivers, and I'm going to level match it because the levels are different. If you take these two drivers and you can see the frequency response is kind of the same here in the middle from 4K up to 13, but the difference is in the very top end. And these two tweeters will sound different. Now the question is, how? I showed this in one of my previous videos, and this is applicable to this video as well. So we will be concentrating above like 2 kilohertz, above this range on the very top end. These graphs basically show us how extra energy or a lack of energy scoop out in a specific range of frequencies influence our subjective perception of sound. So if we take, for example, frequencies above 2-3K, if we have a peak at about 5K, it says edgy, sharp. Peak at 3K, 2K, harsh, bright. Extra energy above 10K, airy. And exactly the same in the opposite side. If you have lack of energy there, it says just lack of air. If you have a scoop out, lacking finesse, drum hits lack power, lacking attack, and that kind of stuff. So if you have a flat frequency response, this is what we call a neutral response, where nothing is accentuated and nothing is really missing. And in SQ, ideally, we would aim for a neutral response. Anything extra or missing, it will be your preference. So if we're coming back to the frequency response, generally speaking, we aim our target for our whole system to look something similar. All the targets are different. You might have a little bit one rolling off, but I aim in the beginning for flat and then I adjust it. This is the target for the whole system, and this would be a target for the tweeter only. So if we would find a tweeter that has this frequency response, which is flat and rolls off, to us, this tweeter would sound totally neutral. So the question is, can we find a tweeter that sounds very neutral? And the answer is obviously yes. One of these is SB26, the big boy, the big massive one that you would probably never put in a car. You can see that it does follow the target almost ideal all the way up to like 10K, and then we have 2 dB of extra energy here, and this above 17 where we really don't hear much, it kind of rolls off. Now, this roll off could be because of the aiming. If you put it more on axis, maybe you would get that top end back. But this tweeter would sound totally neutral in a way that there's no any peaks anywhere, apart from this 2 dB, but there's no extra massive peaks and no scoop outs anywhere. So this would be neutral. I will not go through all of these tweeters. I'm just going to show you a few different ones I have here that are not neutral and what that sound signature should sound like. So for example, if we have this as neutral and we take another two tweeters, we take the PRV and we take the focal axis. The focal axis, to me, is sounded the nicest from all the tweeters that I've measured because it is relatively flat. Like, yes, it needs a bit higher crossover point, so it's not going to play as low as SB26. However, it is totally flat, totally neutral. However, you can see above 15, 16, it has this peak of extra 5 dB of energy. And if we go back to this one, this is our air. So this tweeter sounds very pleasant, very nice, and very airy. The opposite of this is the PRV. I'm just gonna level match it so you could see the difference a little bit better, something like this. This driver, you can see, yes, it does play lower, which is fine, but if we take from 4K and above, this is exactly the same. However, the PRV rolls off below 10K, and at 15, it's minus 10 decibels. So this tweeter will have, you guessed it right, lack of air. Basically, there's no air in the sound signature. So if you compare these two tweeters, you will have a massive difference in how they sound. The focal is going to sound much, much nicer. Now we have another example of one of the peerless drivers, like this one. So this, it does extend a little bit higher, up to 13K, and then it rolls off as well. So it will be lacking air as well. However, the PRV, since it rolls off much earlier, like 10K, it will lack this drum hit, lack of power in treble as well. So again, these two drivers, both of them roll off, but this one, the PRV, is going to lack energy in the drum hits, whereas the Peerless will have those drum hits, but will lack air. And again, if you would compare these two, again, no air and airy. Now, a lot of drivers from here are neutral. So like this, VIFA, like many of them, you will have the option to look at this yourselves. I will upload this specific file and I'm going to leave the link in the video description so you can have a look at this as well. So these neutral drivers, you can see, they're just difference in level as well. So if you, for example, take these two drivers, like SB29 and VIFA, and you would just replace, literally just swap them out while listening to music and do no EQ, no nothing, you will notice that SB29 will be brighter compared to the VIFA and E19 just because of the level. So you have 5 dB difference in level. The frequency response is almost the same. The difference is in level. The higher the level of the tweeter, the brighter the overall sound signature is. So if you come back to the actual house curve, depending on the house curve, if it's flat, it's neutral. If you would have this top end going a little bit higher, it's going to be bright. And if you're going to have it roll off, that's going to be more mellow as the whole sound signature of the whole system. So if you just literally replacing two drivers, one is going to be brighter than the other one just because of the level. Now, if we're comparing, for example, this and this, SB21 and VIFA 19, these will sound, I guarantee, to 99% of the people, they will sound identical. The main difference would be in off-axis response. However, these drivers are so similar in physical size, the dome is very similar as well, that I would guarantee that The only difference you would be able to tell apart is probably this lack of like probably air in this case, because it is a 3 dB difference. It is a small difference, but for professionals, it would be noticeable. So you would be able to tell the difference here. But for most people, you would not be able to tell apart these two drivers. Now, as I mentioned, flat is neutral. Rising up is kind of bright, and rising down is more mellow. Some drivers will have a response that is sloping down like this. I took two examples, ScanSpeak, the big one, and Alpine Type R. They measure very, very similar, but the main thing that you see is that the response from here, it just gently slopes down. It's not as sharp as something like this one, where it just goes flat and drops off. This is just a gentle roll off. This sound signature will be very mellow. A lot of people that listen to like rock and metal and they like to listen at loud levels, they do have this in their house curve where they roll off the top end. And this roll off is like, wow, 6-7 dB from flat to top end. And this will give you a very mellow sound that you will be able to listen for a long period of time. So again, if we're going to compare, for example, Alpine Type R and Focal Axis, this will be much brighter, much more airy, and the Alpine Type R would be much more mellow. If you listen on low volumes, the Focal will sound much nicer and much more pleasant. However, if you would crank it up, the Focal will start to become bright and maybe even harsh, piercing, whereas the Alpine Type R, even at high levels, since it's rolling off, will sound much more pleasant. So again, these two tweeters are the kind of polar opposites of what you're looking for in a system. If you're looking to a lot of metal, probably the Alpine Type R would be a better choice. If you're listening to a lot of like moderate level jazz music, I would go with Focal with a lot of air. Now let's go to the harshness. If we come back to this graph, the harshness comes from extra energy at about 2, 3, 4, 5 kilohertz, somewhere in this range. If you have a peak there, the tweeter will sound harsh. Most tweeters, they're flat, that means they're not harsh and they're neutral. However, some of them, like this is one of the edge tweeters. This is the little horn loaded one. It has, you can see a big peak at 4 kilohertz, which is like probably 6 dB extra of energy here. Now, if you would listen to these two drivers by themselves, the top end, you can see is exactly the same. The difference is extra energy here. And even when I was measuring pink noise, I could tell straight away that this is gonna be harsh. Some tweeters will have this, but not as pronounced, like SB29. It has a little bit more energy here at about 3K, but not as much. If you compare it to totally flat driver, it's still, you can see like 5 dB extra, 4 dB maybe. So if you would cut this with EQ 4 dB, these will sound almost identical. However, some of them will need much more EQ. But again, if you tame this with EQ, it will sound nice, but without EQ, if you're just literally swapping out drivers, if you swap out something like SB29 with this edge, you would automatically hear that edge is much harsher compared to the SB29. Other driver is this Pioneer Carrozzeria, which is that turbine-like looking tweeter. It has, again, a massive peak of like 5 dB at 4 kilohertz. And another one, Peerless, one of the Peerless, this has a smaller peak, but it's still a peak at 3 kilohertz. And this harshness, because you can see this harshness is at different frequencies. So this peaks at 3 kilohertz, and these two are peaking more about 4 and a bit kilohertz. So that harshness will have a little bit different characteristic, a little bit differently harsh, if it makes sense, but it will be harsh. However, if you remove this peak with EQ, all is going to be fine. And this driver will be kind of mellow-ish because it's following the same like the Type R, which just very gently slopes down. This is that big massive bullet tweeter, and bullets, we know that they do have extra energy always here and very, very sharp roll off. So this again will be very harsh, very edgy without EQ. You would need probably 10 dB just to cut it something like this for it to sound nice. And it is kind of okay after that. Like, yes, you would have some energy here, and we'll talk about this energy as well. So some other drivers. These two, Pioneer, the Metal Dome, and one of the DS18s. These have, one of them, the Pioneer, has a peak at 13 kilohertz, and the other one has a peak at 12 kilohertz. Now, this sound signature, you cannot tell it straight away. Let me just very quickly level match it so it would look a little bit something like this. There we go. You wouldn't be able to tell this straight away what's wrong with this tweeter because in the beginning it sounds nice. However, after 1 or 2 minutes of listening, it will be extremely fatiguing in the sense that you can feel that something is wrong, but you cannot pinpoint what, because it's not a harsh, it's not very edgy or bright, but these peaks, especially because they're so sharp, they kind of work more in the background of your hearing, where your ears pick it up as something wrong. But again, you cannot tell what. So after a few minutes of listening to this tweeter, you will have a fatigue, which is like your ears get tired and overstimulated of this. I had very similar experience with this when I had my original OEM Skoda tweeters, which had, I think, at 17K the peak. So any kind of small peak that you have, probably above 10 kilohertz, will be fatiguing. And the higher it is, the less you will be able to point out what's wrong, but the more annoying it's gonna get the longer you're gonna listen to these tweeters. So these two are fatiguing. This recoil, if we're going to come back to this, it does have this peak here, but this is above at 20K. So this is not going to be that fatiguing because it's way there above. The other recoil, the ceramic one, I don't remember the model name, because it's ceramic, it does have a cone breakup at 16, 17K. Now this could be fatiguing as well. Not as much because like from the base level, which is somewhere here, it's like maybe 4 dB. So it's not that much. But over time, it could be fatiguing and it could be annoying. Now, I have another one. One of the Chinese AMT, which is just a no name, and Kicker KS. So these, both of them, actually on Kicker KS, you can see it a little bit better. It is fine here. There's no extra energy here, but the extra energy is wide, centered about 7K. So here at 7K, it says piercing and sharp, and a little bit lower at about 5K, sibilant. This is the word that describes sibilant, is mainly the S's in human language. So when you have and the words that have a lot of S's, those S's will be very kind of sharp and a bit off. So whenever you have energy somewhere above 5K, I want to say 5 to 8K here. So just like this one, KS, it's just ironic that it has a S, KSS, and it's sibilant. And the Chinese AMT that has this peak at 7.5K, these two tweeters will sound sibilant. If you want to avoid this, simply again grab an EQ at 7K and pull it down. However, again, if you're comparing two drivers like this and this, SB21 and Kicker KS, again, if we just level match it a little bit like this, the difference will be between these two drivers, Kicker KS and SB21, that the KS will be sibilant and it will lack air, and SB29 is going to sound neutral. So if you're listening to Kicker KS and you feel that is sibilant, literally you just replace for a different driver without changing anything, and all that sibilance is going to go away. And again, I'm going to repeat myself probably third or fourth time that This is valid, and these comparisons are valid only in my car, in my location, with my gear. Your mileage may vary depending on your install and the locations that you have. For example, this top end response could be that I didn't aim it 100% on axis, but again, the SB21, I did aim it kind of the same, and this one plays all the way up to 22 kilohertz. So it might be the driver, it might be the location. The best way to find out this roll off is to stick the microphone next to the tweeter and take a measurement, because it's near field. It doesn't depend on the on and off axis like on the aiming. So near field response will show you. If a near field response will have this roll off, that tweeter in general does not have any air or any top end. If near field response is going to show you the response all the way up, but in a car you install it and it rolls off, that's the aiming. If you improve the aiming, you will get that response back. But if the tweeter doesn't have that response, it doesn't have that response. Now, let's go to bright tweeters and very mellow tweeters. This comes down, as I mentioned, to the level. I have two tweeters, Alpine DD Drive, which is a tiny little baby tweeter, and the sensitivity of that tweeter is very low. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we have a recoil bullet tweeter that has the sensitivity. And the difference between these two tweeters is 5, 10, 15, 20, or even 25 dB. Now, if you replace one tweeter with the other one and keep the same tune, the same power, the difference of 25 dB, it's enormous. So if you're replacing the tweeters with different sensitivity, the more sensitive one will sound brighter. And the problem is that a lot of times, a brighter sound at the top end for us psychoacoustically correlate with better sound and clearer sound. So like the more top end we have, we perceive it as a clearer sound. So even if you take this bullet tweeter, you EQ it, you take this down, you take this down, and you make it kind of the same shape as this Alpine DD, the sound signature will be different. However, we will perceive it very differently just because of the 15 dBs of level. So when people say, oh, I replaced the tweeter this for that, and this one is much brighter, it's not brighter, it's just higher in level relative to the rest of your system. Because if you have a balanced system, again, we're coming back to this target that I mentioned before. If you have a balanced system where your mid-ranges play on the same level as tweeters, it will sound normal. If you replace the tweeters with ones that are 2-3 dB more sensitive, the top end will sound brighter and the whole system will be brighter. But it didn't change the system, it's just the level. If you would pull that tweeter down by 3 dB, just to match it again, it will sound exactly the same. So we saw a lot of drivers that perform very nice but have a specific kind of thing happening with them. Some drivers, however, I will show you two. One of the Edge, the piezo, very cheapy driver, and Power Acoustics, again piezo. These drivers are just horrible. Literally. When you have subwoofers, SPL subwoofers, and they say it's a one-note wonder subwoofer where it just peaks and doesn't play anything, these are kind of the same. When you have, for example, this Edge, it plays from 7K to 13K. And that's pretty much it. Super narrow bandpass, literally no top end, and nothing below 7K. It will sound very off. This Power Acoustics, again, it just peaks at 10K, extremely fatiguing. Nothing below 6K and nothing above 14. It's just... I would never ever recommend to use these tweeters for any reason. Even if they are cheap, just double up the price and get something like this Vifa NE19, which is I think £20 per driver. So it's just totally different thing. Now, yes, both of them are sensitive. You can see the difference. like 15 dB level. So again, you put this one, it's much more brighter. However, we're going to have a look at the distortion as well. It's a horrible driver. So some drivers are really bad. For example, these Dayton AMTs. So one of the Daytons, the bigger one, and the Dayton AMT mini pod is just wibbly wobbly. No top. Yeah. You could EQ them to the target. They will require quite a lot of EQ to match it to the target, and they will sound somewhat decent. But if you want something that sounds good out of the box, you just use a different driver and it will sound much nicer. So yes, that's pretty much it, because I'm not gonna go through all of them one by one. You can do it by yourselves. Most of them, apart from like these drivers that they don't necessarily have problems, it's just they have a specific sound signature. But if we look at like most of other drivers, you can see like all of these, they're pretty much flat. They don't have any like big issues. You can see most of them are plus minus 5 dB, and they are relatively flat with these differences wibbly wobbly. Could be because of install, could be because of driver, the roll off, could be because of the aiming as well, but most of them are gonna be very, very close to absolute neutral. Now, the only difference is this little, you can see it goes kind of flat, and here is a little bit peak at about 3K. This is kind of normal for corner loaded tweeters when you put them in the sail panels, or sometimes in A-pillars in the dash, where you have a little bit more extra energy here. So 3K minus 5 dB with the EQ, and they will sound very, very nice. And as I mentioned, one of the few that sounds very good without EQ in that location is the SB26, that you can see it doesn't have that peak at 3K. So I wanted to make this video shorter than it is, but I did realize that I expanded quite a lot. However, I hope this gives you a insight why different tweeters can sound different, why they do sound different, and like without having any measurements. And if you're looking for an ideal tweeter, you have absolutely no choice but just to literally swap the tweeters, listen to them, and swap and listen and swap and listen until you're gonna find something. A lot of people do that, and it does make me sad because they're just wasting money instead of having a look at the actual measurements and seeing where is that problem. But we do have a lot of old-timers, old schoolers that run passive crossovers, or just a crossover and an amplifier with no DSP, with no EQ. So if you want a good response without EQ, you need to find a specific driver that does exactly what you want. However, if you have a DSP, if you have the option to EQ, you can make almost any tweeter sound as you wish. And again, it will depend on the crossover point and on the SPL that we will cover in the next upcoming videos. So stay tuned, because we will dive deep into this. I do have some data already filled in. And in the next upcoming videos, we will talk about everything. We're going to talk about sensitivity, crossovers, off-axis, impulse, distortion, frequency response, high-res, intermodulation, price, and I'm going to add probably some other extra stuff. Each of these things will have a separate video, short video, and then I'm going to put everything into a single playlist where you can find all this information. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.